We're building a wall. He's a Mexican. We're building a wall between here and Mexico.
Democrats and Republicans hammered Donald Trump.
Claiming a person can't do the job because of their race is sort of like the textbook definition of a racist comment.
We'll show you how it's affecting the presidential race. And in Florida, Republicans have a new frontrunner in the race for U.S. Senate. It's Carlos Beruff, and he's back to respond to some recent controversies.
They're low in the polls, and they're taking shots at the guy who's at the top of the polls.
We'll also investigate a policy with Cuba that critics say is abusing taxpayers.
People that come to the United States, claim to be Cuban refugees, and then are traveling back and living in Cuba while receiving federal benefits.
And John Wilson is back with My View Now. Plus, we'll bring you the story of D-Day as told by the first American to set foot on the beaches of Normandy.
They're dropping all these bombs right on the place where we were going in.
This is Money, Power, and Politics. Well, Hillary Clinton had a rough couple of weeks, and it surely cost her in the polls. But this week, Donald Trump had a worse week that could cost him much more in November.
We're being treated very unfairly, Bill, very, very unfairly.
When you attack a federal judge on grounds of his heritage, you cannot unring the bell.
We're building a wall. He's a Mexican. We're building a wall between here and Mexico.
Yet Trump repeatedly claimed this American-born judge from Indiana cannot do his job properly because he has Mexican blood, which raised the question that will dog Trump and Republican leaders for months.
Is that not a racist statement?
Yeah, I couldn't disagree more with a statement like that.
Is it a racist statement?
I couldn't disagree more with what he had to say.
Okay, but do you think it's a racist statement to say?
I don't agree with what he had to say. This is a man who was born in Indiana.
While the Republican Senate leader squirmed, the Republican House Speaker was more direct.
Claiming a person can't do the job because of their race is sort of like the textbook definition of a racist comment. I think that should be absolutely disavowed.
And Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said it's the most un-American thing from a politician since Joe McCarthy, and that there will come a time when love of country will trump hatred of Hillary Clinton. It reinforces something Graham said earlier this year.
How could that be? My party is going batshit crazy.
And when Trump was given a chance to dial back his remarks, he did not help his case.
If it were a Muslim judge, would you also feel like they wouldn't be able to treat you fairly because of that policy of yours?
It's possible, yes.
Donald Trump's own staff instructed his surrogates to stop talking about this, but then Trump overruled his staff and ordered them to ramp up the attacks on the judge. And with that, he pulled focus from the controversies that have dogged Hillary Clinton all this time and gave her a chance to come off the ropes and punch back.
Enough with the fear, enough with the anger, enough with the bigotry, enough with the bullying.
Well, Trump certainly has a right to free speech and every right to express his concerns, but by relating his concerns to heritage or race and by claiming an American-born judge is unfair because he's Mexican, he created a distraction he will not easily shake, especially when leaders within his own party won't have it.
It's offensive, it really is, and this week it was a whole new level.
This is one of the worst mistakes Trump has made, and I think it's inexcusable. First of all, this judge was born in Indiana. He is an American, period. If a liberal were to attack Justice Clarence Thomas on the grounds that he's black, we would all go crazy. Every conservative would say it was wrong, and it was racism.
Okay, time now for Republican strategist Adam Goodman. You're an ad man. Can't you see for Hillary Clinton and the Democrats the ad just making itself with the controversy over the judge?
Well, I think the comments that Donald Trump made about the judge, even Donald Trump probably regrets. He's already started to back off a little bit from that. With Donald Trump, you get Donald Trump, pure and unvarnished. And sometimes you're going to like what he says, and sometimes you're not. But what the argument he's making in this campaign is, you're going to love what I'll do for America.
It's time to quit attacking various people that you competed with or various minority groups in the country and get on message.
We're getting more pushback from Republican leadership. Could this lead us to some sort of scenario where the rules could change at the convention? You got to get a supermajority instead of majority, or will this peter out?
Not at all. Isn't it healthy that actually Republicans, and Democrats should do the same, are talking openly, even in disagreement? That's the way it should be. It shouldn't be everyone's marching in lockstep, regardless of whether they believe in something or not. I think that's good for the country. It's good for the party.
Adam Goodman, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Coming up. So you called President Obama an animal, not once, but twice. Polls show Carlos Beruff is the frontrunner in Florida's race for U.S. Senate, so we'll put him to the test. Then John Wilson will join us as we continue our investigation of Cuba. Florida Republicans have a new frontrunner in the U.S. Senate race. A Mason-Dixon poll shows Manatee County homebuilder Carlos Beruff is leading the pack at 17%. He's spent millions on ads, but he's faced some controversy for calling the president an animal.
Here's this animal we call president, because he's an animal, okay?
And for calling for a ban on immigration across the Middle East with the exception of Israel. So we pressed Beruff to see where he would draw the line on his immigration ban, and we asked him to explain his controversial remarks. Mr. Beruff, thank you once again for joining us.
Hey, Craig. Nice to be back.
So you called President Obama an animal, not once, but twice. Tell us, what were you thinking, and do you regret that?
Well, no, I don't have a regret. I'm a bit passionate, and my first language is Spanish. So it's not uncommon when people dismember things that you just call them an animal. But
you've called other people an animal?
Oh, yes.
Who else would be called an animal?
Well, my life is, the guy's acting como animal. It's not that big a deal when you get passionate about describing something like he has done to the military.
Now, but you say there was no racist intent. I understand that. But do you understand why people would read racist intent into it?
No, I don't, because I just don't live in that world.
You've also drawn controversy over your proposal to temporarily ban immigration in all nations across the Middle East, with the exception of Israel. What's your goal here?
There are people in that part of the world who don't like Americans and make no secret about the fact that they'd like to come here and harm us. So until they have a policy that vets those people properly, I think we should not be letting people in from the Middle East, period.
What about Africa? You also have Al-Shabaab in Somalia. You have Boko Haram in Nigeria.
Well, I think it's a global problem. Okay,
would you extend the ban to
I would
Africa
extend
as well?
the ban to anywhere that we cannot properly vet an individual that will not do us harm.
And that includes Africa as well?
That includes wherever that kind of disabled countries are.
But if you cover Middle East, would you also not cover the continent of Africa as well?
I haven't given it much thought. The Middle East seems to be the region that wants to come here to do us harm.
What about
ISIS
Tunisia,
is based in the Middle East.
Morocco, Algeria.
Well, Libya is probably, Libya with ISIS is a new stronghold for ISIS, and ISIS seems to be the predominant force that wants to hurt us. So anywhere that's a danger, then we should probably restrict it, yes.
You look at the influence that Russian terrorists have already had on the United States in Boston. Should we also ban Russian immigration?
I think that the Obama administration needs to stop and address the fact that they don't have a proper vetting system to bring people into this country, and yet we're continuing to allow people to come in.
If you ban it across the Middle East, would you also ban it in Russia, given the threat of terrorism there?
I've been clear on the point. If we can't get them vetted properly, nobody should come into this country. How's that?
Well, you excluded Israel. Are there any other nations?
Well, Israel, because Israel has a better security system than we have by far. Have you ever been to Israel?
Well, I haven't, but I'm aware of the security protocols. So you would ban it in Russia, and you would ban it in nations across Africa?
I would. First of all, the ban is Obama administration's lack of enforcing and vetting process that secures our citizens from harm. So it's pretty simple to me. Until they get that, until FBI Director Comey or the CIA director, who was on 60 Minutes again last Sunday from an interview he taped in February, clearly says that there are people that want to come to this country to do us harm, and we don't have the proper systems in place to vet them. When they say we're ready, then we should probably be ready.
What about countries in South America with terrorists? You have Shining Path in Peru, you have the FARC in Colombia.
Yeah, you're pushing. You know,
well, I'm pushing. I am pushing.
You're pushing an agenda. It's
trying
ISIS.
To find out where you draw.
Okay, it's ISIS who have made it a point to want to come to this country to do us harm.
Okay, ISIS has a presence in Australia. What about Australia?
Well, I think the Australians can take care of themselves.
Okay. Your home company built
ISIS
some homes.
ISIS has a presence in Australia?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. You were unaware of the connections to Australia?
I'm unaware that Australia tolerates the fact that they have ISIS on their property.
Well, they're trying not
on
to.
their country.
They're certainly trying not to.
Okay, that's more like it.
Your home company built some homes with tainted drywall from China.
9 to be exact.
This came up in the campaign. Yes. Why did the company not make the victims of this whole instead of it having to play out in court?
We did. We tried to make them whole, but they wouldn't release us from from any health claims after the fact. So it was fix the houses. Oh, and by the way, we're not going to give you a general release. Well, I'm a business guy. It doesn't make any sense if you're going to go and spend $45,000 to $55,000 remedying a situation to allow them to have still an open forum to go ahead and sue you for years later, some kind of health-related effect. So we said, look, if we're not, why are we going to do it? We went into a class action lawsuit in Louisiana. At the end of the day, about 2 or 3 years ago, they sent us a letter and says, your share of this is $58,000. I wrote them a check, and that was it.
I'll give you a chance to respond to a criticism from Lopez Quintera to your quote about Alzheimer's. You said you're a neophyte in this process. I learn every day. It's sort of like Alzheimer's. Yeah, so I have a new and exciting day every day.
Yeah, it's called a sense of humor.
Well, do you see families afflicted by Alzheimer's would take offense to that?
My mother had Alzheimer's for 14 years, and my grandmother had it for 6. So I think I understand Alzheimer's better than most.
Certainly you do.
Yes, I do.
Did you?
And we used to joke about it, by the way.
How did you joke about it?
Well, my mother, we used to joke about it when she was going, and she used to laugh at it. So it's an issue that politicians want to make because they're low in the polls and they're taking shots at the guy who's at the top of the polls.
Well, this was our second interview with Carlos Beruff. We'll bring you more of our conversations with Beruff and the other Senate candidates later this month. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel for prior interviews that you may have missed. Search for Craig Patrick's Money, Power, and Politics and click subscribe at the top of the page.
Coming up, the push to change our immigration policy with Cuba and claims of Cuban refugees bilking American taxpayers. John Wilson will weigh in with his view when we come back.
The Congressional Budget Office says our immigration policy with Cuba is costing us billions. The CBO report claims we can save nearly $2.5 billion over 10 years by changing the wet foot, dry foot policy. Meanwhile, a judge says he needs more time to figure out how that policy applies to 21 migrants who reached a lighthouse off the Florida Keys. Let's start with Phil Keating to show us what's at stake here.
The question now before a federal judge in Miami is whether this lighthouse, 6 miles offshore in the Florida Keys, counts as American soil or not. These 21 Cuban migrants found clinging to it remain at sea in legal limbo on board a Coast Guard cutter. If the lighthouse is determined to be U.S. mainland, then these Cuban refugees will get to stay in the U.S. under the wet foot, dry foot policy. If not, they'll be shipped back to Cuba. Ramon Saul Sanchez's Democracy Movement filed the federal lawsuit on the refugees' behalf.
To get to freedom, and then when you're about to get to freedom, somebody picks you up from the water and says, your feet are wet, you go back. That's very sad.
But the 20-year-old wet foot, dry foot policy may not last much longer, as its support is eroding among an influential group.
America is really getting fleeced by people who are claiming to be refugees and then are just taking advantage of our welfare system and of this generous immigration law.
Even South Florida's Cuban-American congressional delegation thinks it needs to end, all because of rampant abuse afforded only to Cubans.
We now have growing evidence of people that come to the United States, claim to be Cuban refugees, and then are traveling back and living in Cuba while receiving federal benefits and their families wiring them the money.
Cuban migrant flow has been surging since President Obama and Raul Castro began normalizing relations. Coast Guard interdictions of Cuban boaters and rafters at sea are on pace to exceed 3,000 this year.
Back in March, we spent a week in Havana. We showed how our thawing relations are driving change in Cuba and how it could drive much bigger changes here in Tampa Bay. We found bars and restaurants already packed with American tourists, and we were there when President Obama called on young Cubans to rise up and drive change from within.
I believe citizens should be free to speak their mind without fear.
We also followed St. Petersburg Mayor Rick Kreisman, who's trying to strike a very big deal. He's trying to convince the Cuban government to open a consulate in St. Pete to erase boundaries and build bridges.
To me, having a consulate office in St. Petersburg is a natural fit for who we are as a community, and it's just that next step.
But not everyone agrees, and as we examine both sides of the debate, we ask our former anchor John Wilson to weigh in with his perspective.
This is John Wilson's My View now.
Yeah, my view now with John Wilson. We've got a lot of ground to cover on Cuba. Yeah, we traveled there in 2016, but you traveled there twice before when it was not so easy.
I did. I was there once against the wishes of the Cuban government, and the second time I was in the company of the U.S. Navy. So I was protected the second time. The first time was not. Yeah, that was very difficult, Craig. You're supposed to have, and every time I'll caution you about this, when you see a report from Cuba right now, there's a Cuban handler, a government agent right beside or near that reporter, or will review everything that reporter does. I saw it happen. I saw it happen at CNN. I saw it happen at the others. We were there without a government handler. They eventually discovered that, stole a passport, tried to steal a camera, and made it extremely difficult for us to get out, but we did.
So much has changed since November of 2014 when you retired. Guess what happened 1 month later, December of 2014? So begins the Cuban thaw. Which way is this going?
Well, I think it needs to thaw, but we need to be really careful about it, and I wouldn't believe anything that comes out of the Castro government. That's the issue there. The credibility is zero as far as I'm concerned. And the money that's, that we're promising to the Cuban government in terms of business, what's going to happen? Where does that money go? Is that money going to go to the people of Cuba? I don't think so. That's going to support the government of Cuba. The government also requires, and we do, in transactions, cash payments for products. They're trying to stop that now. I feel good about, on one hand, we're trying to put ourselves back into Cuba and allow Cuba to develop and emerge, and they should. But until that Castro family is gone, Craig, I don't know how we can trust anything that comes out of that government.
Don't know you can trust anything, and yet there's this push to bring a Cuban consulate to Tampa Bay. At the same time, you have very sensitive military operations in Tampa Bay. Good idea, bad idea?
All right, put some stars on your shoulder. You're at CENTCOM or SOCOM. You're dealing with the most highly classified data in the United States military right here in Tampa. Do you want a communist government to be within a mile of you? It's still a communist-controlled government there. It's not a republic. It's not a democracy. Do we want Cuban agents within a few miles of the front gate at MacDill? I don't think so. I'm really uncomfortable with that part of it.
Were you in the Oval Office, or were you to win the White House? You're not running, by the way, but if you did, what would your policy with respect to Cuba be going forward?
Well, I would urge caution, and I would back up a little bit, and I wouldn't be so encouraging in terms of bringing the Cuban government into the United States as if it's an ally. It's not an ally. It's still an adversary, and I think we still have to treat Cuba as an adversary. But on the other hand, we want to try to get doors open and develop some relationships. My hang-up, though, is still the Castro family. And it's not just Raul, the brother who's in charge. The rest of the family is an issue, too. There's a daughter in there who will probably wind up in charge.
John, thank you once more for your time.
You bet.
Coming up, this week America celebrated the anniversary of D-Day, and we have the final interview with the Tampa Bay colonel who led the charge. Hear the story firsthand from the first American to set foot on the beach.
Where was I on D-Day? On duty. They were laying out on the beaches dead. They were in the water dead, and they died for us. I went up and helped take some of the wounded off the beach. There were so many wounded. We were on a ship that was over 300 feet long. There was no more space for the wounded.
That it was something that had to be done. The American people stepped up to the bat and accomplished a tremendous feat.
This week we honored the 72nd anniversary of D-Day, when we stormed the beaches of Normandy to retake France and Europe from the Nazis. But you may not know the first American to hit the beach called Tampa Bay home.
The Department of War, now the Department of Defense, confirmed this man, Colonel Leonard Schroeder, was the first off the landing craft. He led the charge on D-Day and was the first American to set foot on the beach. After the war, he retired in Tampa Bay.
Well, about 80% of the guys in there in that boat were sick, upchucking.
Colonel Schroeder died in 2009, and I sat down with him for his final interview 8 years ago.
They're dropping all these bombs right on the place where we were going in.
He arrived earlier than planned.
And they were running late on that Air Force schedule, and ours, we were jumping a little ahead of time.
So he had to dodge German gunfire and Allied bombs while grounding the boat.
Without getting bombed by our own guys.
As he charged the Nazi fort, machine gun bullets ripped through his arm.
Went through here and when came out there and this just blew out.
But he killed the machine gunner and cleared the path to freedom.
You break a hole in the seawall wide enough and clear enough to let the vehicles and the tanks get through.
Schroeder said he was bullied as a child, even thrown into a hole.
They put me in a damn hole out there in the schoolyard. When the bell rang for everybody to go in the morning, I couldn't get out of that hole.
But he said that drove him to fight as a man, and he stepped up and led the charge into the most important battle of our time.
You may expect to see these boots at the Smithsonian in Washington, and the Smithsonian wanted them there, but Schroeder wanted them here. Next week, we'll bring you a special edition of Money, Power, and Politics. We'll focus on veterans issues and our continuing investigation of forgotten heroes and the war at home. In the meantime, please subscribe to our YouTube channel for extended interviews and prior shows you may have missed. Again, search for Craig Patrick's Money, Power, and Politics on YouTube, then click subscribe at the top of the page. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next week.